Now, today, really thrilled to have with LGW Larry Robertson. Larry is author of several books, including his most recent Rebel Leadership. Best-selling book, has been nominated for lots of different awards. He is a strategic advisor. He is a consultant. He is an author. He is a speaker. And he is also a Fulbright Scholar. I'll ask him later on to talk a little bit about it. Actually, in a couple of weeks, he's going for 5 months to Costa Rica. So Larry is one of those people that does it all and has achieved a lot of success in looking at entrepreneurship, creativity, and leadership. Larry Robertson, Margarita Rosenfeld, and I know you two know each other, says you're amazing. You're so thrilled to, she's so thrilled to have you with us. We really are thrilled to have you. Welcome to Leadership Greater Washington Conversation, Larry.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely my privilege to be here.
Larry, so you've been thinking about leadership. You've been thinking about all these things, writing about it, and you say we need to lead differently because the world has shifted under our feet. And this is before COVID. In what ways has the world shifted before we talk about how we need to lead differently?
Yeah, I'm glad we're beginning with that base, because what I usually say when I describe why I even wrote this book is that we live in these deeply uncertain times, uncertain in ways that we've never experienced before. And, you know, after the past 2.5 years, people generally nod along and say, oh, absolutely, we do. But when I say that, and when I talk about the context for the book, I'm not talking just about the last 2.5 years and the pandemic and everything that's rippled out of it, but indeed the last 22 years. This entire century to date has been more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than anything we've ever known before. And so one of the differences is that this is not a passing wave. This is what I refer to as our new abnormal. And so if you're thinking about or practicing leadership that was built and its best practices were built in a different time, meaning before this century, in fact, how can it possibly apply successfully to the times we're in? And you know, the spoiler alert is that it can't. And a lot of leaders are struggling in this uncertainty. And again, not just over the past 2.5 years, but throughout the last 2 decades. One of the examples I like to pull out, and it's even more poignant now that it was a pre-pandemic survey, but right immediately before the pandemic began, PwC did one of their leadership studies, and they've done these annually for most of the last 20 years. And in it, they surveyed nearly 2,000 leaders across sectors, across all levels of leadership. And they asked them, what's the environment like that you're contending with out there? 82%, I mean, this is 4 in 5 leaders described that environment as unpredictable. And it wasn't just a sweeping statement either, like, oh, it's unpredictable out there, and they moved on to the next thing. This was a accumulation of asking them about technology. How are you using technology right now? How is it affecting your business right now? What about the technology that's coming? About hiring. Who are you hiring? Where are you finding them? Are you sure they're the right people? All through various categories, the answer was the same. But the really stunning thing was that even though this survey came out at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, leaders had been saying the very same thing in similar proportions for 12 years running. So this isn't an anomaly. This is really a shift. And so what I did for the book was not spend time so much recounting that, although there's a first chapter that says, let's look at this uncertainty and see it from a couple of different angles to see that it really is different and it really does affect everybody. And it's very entrenched in what we will be dealing with now, but also for the foreseeable future. After that, it was really to look across the past 2 decades and say, who's thriving in these times? Who are the leaders? Who are the organizations that are actually thriving in this, as the phrase goes, a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous? And they were the ones exhibiting what I came to refer to as rebel leadership.
So, Larry, as you pointed out, even before the pandemic, people were seeing and leaders were seeing the environment being unpredictable and therefore the need to change. Uh, One of the challenges that I would like to get your thoughts on before talking about the different factors that you say it takes with respect to leadership is the fact that somewhat like health, I know I should exercise more. And if you ask me on any survey, I would tell you that I need to exercise more. But if you look at the pattern of my behavior, it's not reflected in what I know needs to happen. With respect to leadership, leaders have been talking about the fact that it's an uncertain environment and it takes different kind of leadership. But there has been very little change with respect to the kind of leadership that is being exhibited based on whether it's survey data or what I see in organizations. So what do you think is keeping leaders from changing if they know the world has changed, therefore their leadership approach needs to change?
Yeah, well, there are lots of contributing factors, but I'm going to make it real simple. It's expectation. So it's what we expect of leaders or what leaders perceive we expect of them, and it's what those leaders expect of themselves. We have this idea of leader equals hero. That leader, the individual leader is somehow the sum total of leadership, and that person will perceive all the problems, all the opportunities, come up with the answers, give the directives, that it's a hierarchical thinking and not just organization. And that's how we cast leaders. When we're taught that from the time we're in elementary school, and the person who stands in front of the class and tells us what the right answers are or aren't, all the way up into our training for the various work we do after we finish school. So what's really striking too, to go to your point, is that what is shifting certain leaders to think differently is that the pain threshold is getting higher and higher by the day. But still, as you say, disproportionately, many leaders are not shifting. I'll give you a really interesting example. It was another survey done, this time of 500 leaders and 5,000, I hate to call them employees, but those who report to them, other leaders in other levels of the organization. And it was done by McKinsey. It was just last summer. And this is, if you might recall, we were hopeful that we were coming out of a last wave, that the fall was going to open up. And so McKinsey was asking these leaders and those they lead, what does the future of work look like? And the leaders answered saying, well, listen, this is exactly what it's going to look like. It's going to be something hybrid, but we'll definitely be in, 2 to 3 days a week. We're going to return to the office within a month. And here's the kicker, it will sustain in that exact way for the next 3 to 5 years. In fact, McKinsey was so stunned by the results that they called it a finish line mentality, as though as long as we get through this, everything will return to either the old status quo or some new status quo. So of those leaders that they interviewed, 75% gave that answer. Here's the real stunner. 75% of those who worked for them, of those 5,000 others they employed, 75% said they didn't believe that. They did not believe that the world was going to settle quickly. And listen, this was overlapping with whatever you want to call it, the Great Resignation, the Great Reshuffle, people actually thinking and moving with their feet to something that they believed more in than the leadership situation they were under in that case. So I find that really stunning. But to come back to the point of this idea of thinking of leaders as heroes, that PwC survey that I referred to, that's confidential. So in confidence, those leaders were acknowledging that the world they had to manage and felt they had to manage on their own was unpredictable. The McKinsey survey, on the other hand, was public. So when it came to their public answer, they were much more certain in their statement, even if it conflicted with what they were really thinking about the challenges of leadership. So why have more not shifted? I don't know. That's a very nuanced question. But can they wait much longer? I think the answer is no. And I think their employees are telling them in very significant ways by leaving.
And I wonder, Larry, if we as a society contribute to that. There are different factors, as you mentioned, leader as a hero. Uh, at LGW, one of the great things we do is we recognize a leader that has contributed over the years. So typically someone at the end of their career in our celebration of leadership. But I make fun of the fact that we have a leadership award industrial complex, right? So there isn't a week that goes by that a magazine or a newspaper or a group is not awarding, you know, the 20 leaders under 20, the 10 leaders under 10. I mean, it's incredible, and we are honoring the leader, right? The person, the individual at top of the organization, because those are the people that get us the most advertising. Those are the people that get us the most business, whatever we're trying to do business wise. So we're not recognizing teams, we're not recognizing organizations. And most leaders now have learned when they stand in front of a group, they say, I want to thank everyone on my team and my organization. But from a society and communication perspective, we are still recognizing the person.
Yep. Yep, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you had asked me if it was just if society was amplifying this ongoing challenge of thinking of the leader as equivalent to leadership, I would have given the examples that you just gave. It's in every headline, either somebody succeeding in that heroic way or failing in that heroic way. Those are the headlines that dominate, in addition to the awards and so on. You know, it's to the point that several organizations have turned those awards into a business. You can buy your name into that list that says you're a great leader. And this is just a commentary on a fact rather than a statement of whether that's right or wrong, and there's more to it. But the point is that we believe in it enough that we actually exchange on that basis. That's how we get promoted. That's how we think we get hired, and so on. Or at least that's what we think will get us hired. But for anybody who's taking a slightly longer term view of things, no one person ever leads in entirety. No one person ever has all the answers. In fact, leadership is something that is, when it's successful, is cultural. It's cultural in every way. The leader's job is not to have all the answers. The leader's job is to create an environment where everybody can step forward and lead, each in their own way. And that can't just be a mandate, and that can't just be standing behind those statements. That's a great start. It can't just be rewarding for that or hiring for that. Also great things. It has to be cultural in every way. In fact, I spent a good deal of time in the research for the book talking to organizations that have been thriving in these uncertain times, asking them what made the difference. And when they said culture, asking them point blank, you know, that's a great answer, and everybody says that. And in fact, the data shows that everybody says that, but they don't necessarily follow it. So my next question was, what is culture? And when I interviewed Russell Schaefer, who's the Senior Director of Global Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion at Walmart, he said, culture is the things that we do or are doing right now. Not what we did, not what we will do, but our words and values and actions in this moment. And so when you think about that, that can't be reduced to one person. It can't be that one person claiming the great brand that they've developed, or the great organization that has been, or that one person who gives the vision of where it can be. It's everybody who's doing it right now. And in fact, I'll add one more perspective on this. When I interviewed Melissa Thomas Hunt, who at the time was the head of global diversity and belonging at Airbnb, she said, I'm going to read it for you. She said, culture comes from the way people behave, how they engage, what they give currency to, the markers of their language, what's sanctioned and taboo, and all of this to the smallest parts and places. So that to me says this is a job of the many, not of the few, to build an environment where everybody can step forward in that way and behave according to where it is we want to go together. That, I think, is really leadership in truth. And it's always been leadership in truth. It's just that in a less volatile world, you can get away more with one person being disproportionately credited as the leader or being given disproportionate responsibility, because there's time to work through when that doesn't work. In an uncertain world, when everything speeds up, there's no time for that.
Yeah, and that volatility you talk about, Larry, also requires the ability to tap into the collective intelligence. The less volatility with less information that was coming at us, one individual could stay on top of everything. But now it's the collective, tapping into the collective that matters. But you titled your book Rebel Leadership, and that by itself is not a usual title, because rebels are seen as people outside of doing things outside of the norm. Why rebel leadership?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, one of the things I've really loved about having this book out there over the past 11 months now is that the title really does grab people's attention. But in many respects, it grabs their attention thinking I'm about to say something that, you know, they have in their head versus what I really mean when I use the words rebel and leadership. So I think of it as a combined term, and it really brings both the best of rebel and the best of leadership to the meaning behind the book. So the rebel isn't the person who's taking risks for the sake of risk, looking to disrupt for the sake of disruption. It's actually the person who's open, ongoing. It's the person who's reconsidering what they're doing and what their assumptions are and whether or not they still apply. And often they do, but the fact is they remain open to seeing something different, and not just through their own eyes, but through the eyes of others. That's how we have thought about people we've often labeled rebels, creatives, entrepreneurs, and so on, people who think about doing things differently, and they get there because they are open. On the leadership side, I'm really talking about what I said earlier. It's not the person who sees themselves as in charge of and at the head of a group of others. It's the person who understands that their real job is to create an environment where everybody can lead. So rebel leadership and practicing it is actually practicing what we all know we should do, and what we all know in some way works and works better than those other images we have of rebels and leaders. So being a rebel leader is stepping into that truth and actually stepping up to those things that make us collectively better. That's what rebel leadership means in this case. It's not a scorched earth kind of person.
So in the rebel part, you underline, Larry, the openness that is required. And I don't want to speak for all the leaders at LGW, but vast majority of leaders that I know I coach and work with, when they're initially asked, they see themselves as being extremely open. So it's typically a conversation about others, not about me and us. In the leaders that you have studied and interacted with, what makes the characteristics and what are the practices of the ones that are truly open, don't just perceive themselves as being open?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm gonna meet you kind of in the middle on answering it. So you you referred to the leaders that I've talked to, and this applies to those, but I'd like to broaden it into some research that's been done over the past 5 or 6 years by a gentleman by the name of Brad Stulberg and his partner in research, Steve Magnus. And what they research is human performance. So what does human performance mean in any setting? In other words, how can we continue to perform at peak, to be our best? And what they find are the 2 key factors for somebody being able to continue to succeed in whatever their role is, elite athlete or head of an organization or head of a country, whatever it might be. One is openness, but it's that continuous openness. It's not what should I say, episodic openness. You know, oh, that looks like a great idea I see out there, so I'm going to be open today, even though for the last 90 days, I've just been going along with the process we all know and not thinking beyond it. Or more, that looks like a problem. I should be open to different solutions. So they're really talking about this extreme and continuous openness that allows for anything to come through. But they add another factor that's really critical, and I've seen this in leaders too. It's openness, but it's also the willingness to embrace extreme discomfort. So here's where a difference comes, right? You're saying that a leader may typically say, I'm open, right? And I'm comfortable with that. I like being open. He's not or she's not, and I don't like that. What happens if the language is put in the mouth of the other person? What if they're saying, I'm open, and they're saying to the leader, you're not in the least. In fact, if you want to be open, embrace my ideas and empower me to lead. That's pretty uncomfortable right there, right? The example I use in the book is, think of like a world-class athlete, like that's been around for a while, a Tiger Woods, a Naomi Osaka, and think of how they have multiple times reinvented something about their game. So they've moved away from what is making them a success in that moment in order to embrace something that might make them a success longer term. They put themselves in the hands of a coach or others in order to get there. So they're not in the lead in that moment. They're not in control. And yet they continue to do this repeatedly over time, because what they want is that peak performance to continue ad infinitum into the future. And what they realize along the way is, in order for human peak performance to continue ongoing, you have to allow others to be providing the peak and leading in that peak. So that analogy applies very much to people who are effective and impactful leaders over time. They're open in every way, kind of as a matter of course, as a habit, and they're also willing to embrace that extreme discomfort. And the biggest discomfort is handing off the lead and empowering somebody else to take it when they're the more appropriate leader in that time.
It is a big discomfort. And again, you address that in your book. Now, in your key insights, Larry, I read 75 plus leadership books a year, partly for the podcast, partly because I love content. And I had not come across someone talking about soul in leadership until reading your book. So the first principle or key insight you mentioned is that soul matters most. What do you mean by soul when it comes to leadership?
Sure. What I love to do is just tell you a little story about the origin of that, and then tell you exactly what that means. So for one of my earlier books that was focused on entrepreneurship, I interviewed over 200 entrepreneurs, and across them, I would continue to have this experience when I asked this question. And the question was, through all the highs and lows, right? The ups and downs that I think all of us associate with entrepreneurship and innovation, what asset or what key strategic thing has mattered most to you? And that was really open-ended. It could be a physical asset that's accounted for on their balance sheet. It could be somebody in their organization. It could be market share, whatever it might be. And almost to the person, their answer was soul. That soul mattered most, not just for them individually, but for their ability to move the entire organization forward. And what they meant by soul was not the religious association we might put with it, or just the general adjective we sometimes use it at. What they meant was a form of identity, but specifically their identity in the context of what they did and how what they did impacted and connected to others. So I'm just gonna say that again. It's your identity in the context of what you do and how what you do impacts and connects to others. So the idea behind soul is some sense of who you are and how you bring that out, or what the best parts are of you that you bring to your work. But with this idea that none of it matters unless you're connecting to and impacting and even inspiring others. So it's this, we often talk about shared purpose in the organization, which is a really important concept. But if any one of us, not just the leader, if any one of us comes to this idea of shared purpose and tries to pursue it in an organization, and we don't have that sense of soul, that sense of what our identity is and how what we do connects to and impacts others, then we're going to be less equipped to actually pursue that shared purpose, to actually cultivate it in what we do and in the culture in which we do it, because we don't have a sense of ourselves. And this doesn't just apply to leaders, it applies to leadership. So that sense should be there in the ideal circumstance for everybody in the organization. It doesn't mean you know yourself perfectly, but it does mean you've considered who you are and how what you do connects to and impacts others. That's what soul meant, and that's why they thought it was the most important thing.
Yeah, and I love that, Larry, because we were talking earlier about leaders with positional power in many instances not seeing opportunities for improvement in themselves. And the leadership award industrial complex, as I was referring to it. And part of what that contributes to is a level of imposter syndrome when we get a chance, and I get a chance to go deeper with leaders, because that soul and that self-understanding is lacking. There is almost like putting up an image that is also reinforced about the heroic leader. And it makes it harder for those leaders to access their own soul.
That's absolutely right. I was going to say, we're coming full circle to this concept we all have in our heads, and it particularly haunts leaders of leader as hero. The more I'm beholden to that, the more I let that drive my thinking and my decision making, my willingness to let other people lead and to create or not create a culture of leadership, the more I let that dominate, the less likely I am to understand what my identity is in the context of what I do and how that connects to and impacts others. It's just, you're thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about that connection to everybody else. So it's perfect the way you said it.
But we love those stories from Elon Musk to whoever else. We love the stories of the one person that is the hero. So that so matters. You also talk about leadership being a collective thing. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and actually, the implication is it is collective, but I'm going to pull out the language I use in the book. I talk about leadership moving. That leadership, when it's effective, moves. And so the two thoughts that I always reference are, number one, that we as human beings, going back tens of thousands of years, are built to work together. We're a tribal species in the most positive sense. So even in ancient civilizations, was there somebody designated as the chief or leader, male or female? Often there was. But in the most successful ones, leadership actually moved, so that on any particular day, depending what the challenge was or the opportunity was, depending what the skills were of the individuals involved, the leader might be the medicine woman, or it might be the gatherers, or it might be the hunters, and not necessarily the chief. The leadership itself moved across the team, if you will, in order to make sure that the team succeeded in every way. So that concept hasn't gone away. In fact, as a species, it's really embedded in who we are, even though in, say, the last 150 years with very industrialized approaches to how we do work, we've thought in more rigid terms, we've thought in more hierarchical terms, but who we are is really deeply within us, no matter what the last 150 years say. The other story I like to point to is what Doug McMillon said when he took over Walmart about 7 years ago now. And he was asked about the challenging times and how he was going to contend with them. And he said, the one thing that's really critical to think about is that it used to be that an organization like ours, and think about that, an organization that's been enormously successful, has a huge war chest, in theory can do whatever they want, has lots of people. It used to be that an organization like ours made strategic choices annually, maybe quarterly. Now, he said, it's daily. And the only way to cover that is to allow leadership to move. When you have 1.3 million employees across the globe, you can't possibly contain that in one person or one C-suite or one title level or anything. That you have to let leadership move. That's what that second insight of the book is all about. And shared purpose helps to anchor that, because the fear leaders have is, okay, if I let other people lead, if I actually empower them to lead, chaos is going to ensue. Not so if you have shared purpose, if it's embedded in the culture, and even better, if that shared purpose has been collectively created.
So Larry, one part of it is the mindset and the acceptance that that uh, collective needs to be able to move where individuals step up to leadership of the team, but to make it tangible for leaders that are involved in LGW, running their teams, whether teams of 550 or 500.
Mm.
Beyond and besides the mindset, are there process systems, other approaches that enable this? So someone nods and says, Larry, I got you. I agree. Leadership is a collective thing. Okay. After saying it and feeling comfortable with it, now
Right.
what do I do? We've got shared purpose, but now what do we do? Are there systems, approaches that make this a reality that people can look into, or practices they need to take on?
So the final answer to your question is yes, absolutely. But there's a warning that goes along with it. And then I'll tell you a very specific one. Okay, so the answer is yes, there are processes and approaches. The warning is that we too often, especially as senior leaders, once we recognize and nod along with Larry and say, yes, we need to make a change, or whatever it is we're nodding to, we try to jump to system in the sense that we most often think of system, something that embraces every aspect of what we do immediately. And that's just unrealistic. So the organizations that have been the most successful in moving in this direction and then actually gaining speed quickly in changing things gradually across the entire organization do simple things. Okay, and I'll give you two examples. One is an approach that Peter Drucker used to suggest. So when he would be asked, which companies do you think are going to survive into the future? Which do you think are going to be the most successful? He said, to get to that answer, I would ask that company, what business are you in? But I would ask it 5 layers deep, so that the obvious answer of what business you're in isn't the one we're looking for. That answer right now may be a good answer for this time and this place and this market. But if you keep pushing and saying, yeah, let's go below that answer. What business are you in at this level? And all the way down 5 levels deep, you actually get to something that's more core to who you are, actually often independent of the business model. That if you're aware of that, and you allow it to bleed into your business model and what you do, you're likely to be much more successful. I'll give you an example of it, because Airbnb used this Drucker test. What business are you in? 5 layers deep. And their final answer was belong anywhere. That is their business, to belong anywhere, not just their guests, but their hosts within the system, their employees within the organization, their partners. How do we use that? I call it a power source. How do we use that deeper power source to start to drive our decision making? And they were really tested by this when the pandemic hit. They were one of the industries that was hit hardest by the pandemic, and including the choice to lay off 1/3 of their workforce. And they did it all. They were about to go public. They did it all within the context of, what does it mean to belong anywhere? And what do we need to do, sometimes in dramatic ways, to ensure that we are all moving that direction, even the people we let go? So that's one way. It's just to ask that question. I'm not talking about what actions you take once you go 5 layers deep, but how often do we ask that question? Here's another example, and this one I think is really powerful, and it was taught to me by a woman named Deb Meyer. She's a MacArthur Fellow winner. She's an education reformer, and she calls it the 5 habits of the mind. And not surprisingly, it's 5 questions. So the 5 questions that she uses in team meetings, she uses individually for herself. This is something a leader can do on their own, right? They can do it with a team. She uses it across organizations well. The first question is, how do we know what we know? Every day she's asking this question. It's called revisiting your assumptions. And that's such a simple thing that leaders can do. It doesn't say you have to make a change. It says you have to be in tune with what your assumptions are and whether or not they still apply. The second habit of the mind, the second question is there a pattern? Because sometimes when the factors around assumptions change, it's an anomaly. That's not what we're interested in. But if it starts to repeat, if it starts to develop a pattern as a problem, as an opportunity, that's what we want to tune into. The third habit of the mind is some form of the question, what if? What if, given what we know, given what the pattern is, we did X to solve the problem, to pursue the opportunity? The fourth habit of the mind is there another way? And think about it, it's almost like a repeat. How do we know what we know? Is there a pattern? What if we did this? Oh, but is there another way? Because there's always another way. So I call that the habit of the mind, so that you don't fall in love with your idea too deeply. And the fifth habit of the mind, the fifth question is, who cares? So think about that. If leaders looked at what their assumptions were regularly, not just in crisis or opportunity, they looked for the patterns, they explored what if, right? They reminded themselves that there's always another way. So you're making this comparison of what the opportunities are that are available to you. And you tied all of that to who cares. I guarantee you that you start to look at how you do your business and see ways you could do it better. So it's a very, very simple thing that moves you into that action zone. And it doesn't tell you what your annual report is going to say next year. It doesn't tell you what the business plan you put together with your team is going to look like. It gives you the context into making those decisions better. You're already making those decisions. This is about making them better. And sometimes it boils down to asking simple questions.
Larry, I would give you a standing ovation, and LGW folks know I'm a big hugger. LGW, we are huggers, and I'm a big hugger. I would leap across the room if we were physically together, now virtually, and hug you and say the last 4 minutes, and I'm going to underline a couple of things that you mentioned, are absolutely brilliant, and a couple of the biggest challenges I see organizations consistently have of all sizes. Yep. Organizations that are small and organizations that are bigger, and you gave everyone the framework of how to tackle it. First of all, the what business are we in? Not that initial question that everyone nods and everyone knows the answer. Going deeper with respect to that, what business are we in? There is a lot that can be uncovered through that kind of conversation. And then the 5 habits of the mind that you mentioned from Deb Meyer, brilliant questions that if we really ask them with an open mind of trying to fully understand, can really move the organization forward. So I would clip the video, clip the audio of these last 5 minutes. Everything you say is brilliant. But listen.
So let me add to that, because everything we talked about before is a convenient excuse not to do what we just talked about in the last 4 minutes. Every time we conclude leader as hero, we not only don't want to open up to a team, we don't open up to ourselves as leaders. It's a fact. Okay, and if you think about it long enough, you know it's a fact that applies to each of us individually. Every time we look at the uncertainty that's around us and we conclude, as soon as we get through this form of it, this moment will be okay, is an excuse not to ask those questions about how might we do things better. So, I agree with you. That's my favorite part. I think it's the key thing. It's the thing that turns towards action. But we're in this habit of forgetting the context. And so even though it took longer, I'm glad we spent time on that as well. I'll tell you one last thing, and I apologize for interrupting, but this is really important. The 5 habits of the mind are super powerful because they are questions. But one of the things, and it ties back to that, that idea of being open all the time. I mean, they're habits you use daily. They're not habits you use periodically or when you have a problem. And Deb's really specific about that. But she's also said that some people have used them to success and then relegated them to failure. And the way they do that is to turn them from questions into statements. Instead of how do we know what we know, it becomes this is what we know. Instead of is there a pattern, it's this is the pattern, and so on down the line. So this whole idea of allowing that question to remain open is one of the most powerful things that a leader can embrace. And it's also one of the most frightening, because it asks you to be willing to go on to something new if your question actually brings a better way or a better idea, especially if you're involving others. So I just wanted to put that in there, because I know, and Deb knows, people who go through those questions once and think the job is done. This is like that McKinsey conclusion of the finish line effect and the finish line mentality many leaders have. So I just wanted to tie that together.
Love that, and could spend hours just on that. But I do want to touch on a couple of couple of other things. If anyone attending live has questions, feel free to submit them. I will incorporate those. You also mentioned it's the culture, stupid. And we hear a lot about culture, Larry. How do you define it, and how does it impact Rebel leadership?
Yeah, so the way that I define it is really the way that Russell Schaefer and Melissa Thomas Hunt defined it earlier when I gave their answers. And I'll just remind you of Russell's simply because it encompasses what Melissa's saying and what every other leader that I've talked about who understands that culture isn't an outcome, right? This is one of the ways we relegate it to not materializing the way we want it to. It's an action. It's your chief competitive advantage. It's, as Russell said, the things we do and are doing right now. He even said it's a litmus test, because if the things we're doing right now are not in alignment with what we want ourselves to be or what we believe ourselves to be, that's an early warning signal. And so this idea of culture is something we'll get to later, is why I titled that chapter, It's the Culture, Stupid, because it's the first thing. It's the thing that should come first. It's the thing out of which everything else grows, whether it's adaptability or it's innovation or it's stability within an organization, cultivating an organizational leadership, everything comes from culture.
Outstanding. And you also then build on that and you say, find your power source and make it your superpower. What do you mean by that, Larry?
So, excuse me, a power source is the thing that I kind of footnoted when I was talking about Drucker's approach to what business you're in. Once you get 5 layers deep to something that goes beyond the business model and structure and responsibilities and things like that, something that is almost evergreen, that could develop future business models, that's your power source. So let me give you a couple of other examples. What makes Subaru Subaru? The answer is love. That's their power source. Now, as silly as that sounds, they use it to guide everything they do. How can we, with every interaction with our employees, with our customers, with all the organizations we donate to, how can we make Subaru Subaru? How can we point to that? Okay. Walmart, theirs is live better. I mean, we often think of Walmart as low prices, but no, that's just one manifestation of how do we ensure that people are living better. Petco calls itself not the pet resource, they call themselves the health and wellness company. So they're there to both make pets healthy, but also their owners and the community of pet owners. So the idea of this power source is something bigger and something that you have to enable and empower and reward everyone in your organization to tap, so that you get this more diverse meaning out of what that is and how it can play out as a business. In some ways, it is the root of all innovation and adaptability for any organization. That's what a power source is. And the more you see it, and the more you think about it, and the more you embrace it, that's when it becomes a superpower.
Yeah, and even with respect to LGW, I would love to have a conversation with some board members and others what our power source is as an organization in this region. Your fifth point, Larry, is the long view matters, but it matters right now.
Yeah. So I'll put it simply in just thinking about time here. We all have this idea of where we want to go, whether it's at the end of the year or it's 20 years from now, right? And some people call that a mission. Some people say it's their vision, whatever it is. But if actions towards that are not noticeably embedded to everything you're doing right now, then it always remains some distant dream. You're not really making progress towards it. So this is a Google at the height of their success, and this was about 8 years ago, did this project called Project Oxygen. I mean, they're dominating the market, and they do this project to say, what is actually making us successful? How should we cultivate that as leaders within our organization? How should we hire and promote to make sure that that's part of future leadership? And what they thought it was how tech smart they were. And what came back was that was actually at the bottom of the list of things that were important. It was about a communication. It was about team building. It was about being able to build a culture and not just talk about the culture. And those were leading to the greatest successes. So this idea of the long view matters right now is bringing those kinds of thoughts and observations and questions and exercises into the immediate to make sure that even if you're enormously successful in this moment, you will continue to do that. And it's not just talk about it, it's bold action. It's not just stating a mission, it's actually embedding it in some kind of exercise that involves everybody. That's what that one is.
And there is so much more in the book, Rebel Leadership. I wanted to touch on the adjacent possible, but people will need to read the book. I love that. And so much more, Larry. I want to ask, before I ask the last question, Debbie will also put a link in the chat for the participants to fill out a survey. But I want to ask Larry your thoughts and advice based on Rebel Leadership for leadership Greater Washington leaders. In that, I know you are somewhat familiar. By the way, Larry lives in Arlington, Virginia, is on his way to Costa Rica for 5 months, but he will be back. So he will join us in person at some point, and I look forward to that. The leaders in LGW, Larry, 2/3 business, 1/3 government and nonprofit, all have a strong commitment to building relationships for the positive impact on the community, are very aligned with that. So with the world changing, with the accelerated pace of change and greater uncertainty, how can we as leadership Greater Washington embrace the Rebel leadership? Would love to get your thoughts and perspectives on LGW.
As a community, is that really? Yeah. Let me answer it this way. There are 5 insights that come out in Rebel leadership, and we've stepped through each of them from soul mattering most all the way to the long-term matters right now. Okay. The first thing to recognize is that these aren't a tick list. So I wouldn't recommend to any individual leader or to leadership Greater Washington as a community that they somehow pursue one and fail to recognize that they work together as a framework for thinking ongoing, just as I would not recommend that you do it once and then you never do it again. You never consider what soul is again. But what I love about those 5 things together, and the reason I believe they worked so successfully for organizations as small as a dozen people all the way up to a Walmart, that's well over 1 million, is that they apply to broader and broader groups of people, including communities like Leadership Greater Washington. So for example, those 5 habits of the mind that we talked about, you can discuss that as a community of Leadership Greater Washington and what that means to you. You can discuss power source in the context of the community. And I don't just mean people in the membership, but as you said, people rippling even further out into the community. These aren't things that are limited to an organization or a corporation or some legal structure. They really are things that involve people. And so that can be applied anywhere. And frankly, I think it's as simple as that, and not treating it as a list where if I get a couple of those, I'm better off and I've done my job. No, it's thinking about them together and thinking about them together ongoing.
That's outstanding. And Larry, do you mind taking a minute or two telling us what you are going to Costa Rica to study? Because I think that ties well with the passion of a lot of LGW folks. And then I'll wrap up after that.
Absolutely. So as you referenced earlier, Costa Rica and Fulbright go together. The Fulbright grant that I was awarded takes me down to Costa Rica to team to do some research. So the first thing is I'm teaming with somebody who knows entrepreneurship very well, but in a completely different context. Latin America, very focused on agriculture, 40% of their student body from different countries in Africa. It's a different perspective on the topic. So we're actually, my research partner and I have been exchanging for over 2 years these kinds of questions and how we come at them differently. And then the idea is to continue to build on that and to reach out to remote indigenous communities in Latin America who never are exposed to this kind of thinking. And by invitation, by them inviting us into their communities, to share some of these ideas with them to address specific infrastructure problems like access to clean water or, sustainable agriculture, whatever it might be, but also to help them build as a community and build small businesses, like a small economy within their own communities, so that they don't have this disproportionate dependence on their country's economy. That's what we're going down to do. And frankly, it's all a big question. We believe we're headed down the right path, but we're staying open to the fact that we have a lot more to learn. So that's what I'll be doing down there.
That's outstanding. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed, whether in this conversation or the interactions with you, Larry, is that when you talk about leadership, whether as someone who has studied it and studied entrepreneurship and creativity, as a Fulbright Scholar, you have the humility and the approach that you talk about in your book. So it's not just in the book, you show it yourself, and really appreciate you joining LGW in this conversation. Safe travels to Costa Rica. Look forward to hearing your insights when you come back in person in Greater Washington, D.C. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Larry Robertson.
Thanks, Mahan. It's been a privilege.